The gunshot that rang out across the prairie that morning wasn't meant for Flora Zimmerman, but it changed everything between her and the man who'd lived on the neighboring ranch for the past 20 years. Flora dropped the basket of laundry she'd been carrying to the line, her heart hammering as she saw Xavier sprinting across the fence line that separated their properties, his hat flying off behind him, his weathered face twisted with concern she'd never seen directed at her before. "Get inside," he shouted, and Flora didn't hesitate, gathering her skirts and running for the small ranch house her late husband had built 15 years ago. Frank was right behind her, slamming the door and positioning himself at the window with his rifle already drawn. His broad shoulders filled the frame as he scanned the horizon, and Flora found herself staring at him instead of the potential danger outside, this man she'd known for 2 decades, but suddenly seemed like a stranger. "What's happening?" she managed to ask, pressing her back against the kitchen wall. "Rustlers been working the area for weeks. They hit the Morrison place last night, killed 2 of his hands. I saw 3 men riding toward your south pasture this morning." Frank's voice was steady, controlled, but his knuckles were white on the rifle stock. "You shouldn't be out here alone anymore, Flora." She wanted to argue, wanted to remind him that she'd been managing this ranch alone since tuberculosis took her husband William 5 years ago, but something in Frank's eyes stopped her. The way he looked at her wasn't the neighborly concern she'd grown accustomed to over the years. There was something deeper there, something that made her breath catch. The afternoon passed in tense silence, Frank refusing to leave until he'd ridden the perimeter of her property twice and checked every building. Flora made coffee and watched him through the window. This tall, lean cowboy who'd always been part of the landscape of her life, but never quite in focus. He was 52 years old now, same as her, his dark hair streaked with silver, his face lined by decades of Texas sun and wind. She'd attended his wife's funeral 12 years ago, stood beside him at the graveside while he held his 2 young sons' hands. She'd brought him casseroles and bread for months after, the way neighbors did. They'd helped each other through harsh winters and brutal summers, mended shared fence lines, rounded up each other's stray cattle, but they'd never been more than that. Good neighbors, reliable friends. So why was her heart racing now as he walked back toward the house, his boots kicking up dust, his eyes finding hers through the window? "All clear for now," Frank said as he came inside, removing his hat and setting it on the table. "But Flora, I need to speak plain with you. This situation isn't going to improve. Those rustlers are getting bolder and you're vulnerable out here." "I can handle myself," she said, more defensively than she intended. "I've been doing it for 5 years. I know you can." Frank's voice softened and he took a step closer. "You're the strongest woman I know, but that doesn't mean you should have to face everything alone." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. Frank was staring at her with an intensity that made her skin warm, and she suddenly became aware of how close they were standing, close enough that she could smell leather and sage and something distinctly him. "Frank," she started, but he held up a hand. "I need to say something I should have said a long time ago," he interrupted, and his voice was rough now, uncertain in a way she'd never heard from him. "I've been a coward, Flora. For years, I've been the worst kind of coward. After Margaret died, I told myself I was done with all of this, with feeling anything for anyone. I raised my boys and worked my ranch, and that was enough. Or at least I convinced myself it was." Flora's mouth went dry. She wanted to speak, to stop him, to let him continue. She couldn't decide which. "But it was a lie," Frank continued, taking another step closer. "Because every morning for the past 20 years, the first thing I've done is look out my window to see if there's smoke coming from your chimney. Every time I heard a rider coming up the road, I hoped it was you needing something, needing me. When William died, I wanted to be the one to comfort you, to take care of you, and I hated myself for even thinking it because a good man doesn't think those things about his neighbor's wife. Frank, Flora whispered, but her voice failed her. You've always been the one for me, Flora, he said, and the words hung in the air between them like something sacred and terrifying. Since the day you and William moved here in 1858, when I rode over to welcome you both and you smiled at me, I knew. I knew, and I buried it deep because you belonged to someone else, and I had a wife, and that was how things were supposed to be. But we're not young anymore, and I'm tired of pretending I don't love you. I'm tired of finding excuses to ride over here just to hear your voice. I'm tired of lying awake at night in an empty house wishing you were there beside me. Flora's legs felt weak. She gripped the edge of the table, her mind reeling. 20 years. He'd felt this way for 20 years, and she'd never known, never suspected. Or had she? Were there signs she'd deliberately ignored because acknowledging them would have complicated everything? I don't expect anything from you, Frank said quickly, misreading her silence. I just needed you to know. With those rustlers out there and the world being as dangerous as it is, I couldn't stand the thought of something happening and you never knowing how I felt. So now you know, and if you want me to leave and never speak of this again, I'll respect that. But Flora, if there's any chance you might feel even a fraction of what I feel for you, I'm asking you to let me court you properly. Let me protect you and care for you the way I've wanted to for 2 decades. Flora stared at him, this man who'd been as constant as the prairie itself, and suddenly saw 20 years of small moments in a new light. The way he'd always insisted on helping her with the heavy work. The way his face lit up when she brought over fresh bread. The way he'd found excuses to linger over coffee, talking about everything and nothing. The way he'd held her a moment too long at Margaret's funeral, as if drawing strength from her presence. The way she'd caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she'd convinced herself she was imagining. I loved William, she said slowly, and Frank nodded. I know you did. I loved Margaret too. Good people who deserved our loyalty, and we gave it to them completely. His voice was gentle now, understanding. But they're gone, Flora, and we're still here. We're still alive, and I don't think either of them would want us to spend whatever years we have left alone. Flora's eyes burned with sudden tears. She thought about the loneliness of the past 5 years, the weight of silence in her house, the way she'd sometimes stood at her window looking toward Frank's ranch and feeling an ache she couldn't name. She thought about how relief had flooded through her when she'd seen him running toward her that morning, how safe she'd felt with him in her house, how right it seemed to have him here. I used to tell myself you were just a good neighbor, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But good neighbors don't make your heart race when they smile. They don't invade your dreams or make you find reasons to walk past their property. I've been lying to myself too, Frank. Maybe not for as long as you have, but at least since William died. Maybe even before, though I'm ashamed to admit it. Frank's breath caught, hope flaring in his eyes. Flora, I'm scared, she confessed. I'm 52 years old and I feel like a girl again, and it terrifies me. What if we ruin everything? What if this thing between us isn't what we think it is and we lose the friendship we've built? Or what if it's exactly what we think it is? Frank countered, reaching out slowly to take her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, and Flora felt electricity shoot up her arm at the contact. What if we could have something real and true and honest? We're not children, Flora. We know what we're risking and what we stand to gain. She looked down at their joined hands, his so large and rough, hers smaller but equally work-worn. 2 people who'd spent their lives working hard, surviving, enduring. Didn't they deserve some happiness? I don't know how to do this, she said. It's been so long since I was courted. I don't even remember how it's supposed to work. Frank laughed, the sound surprised and genuine and full of joy. I don't either. We'll figure it out together. We'll go slow, do things proper. I'll come calling on you, bring you flowers, take you on buggy rides. We'll give people something to gossip about over their Sunday dinners. Flora couldn't help but smile at that. Fort Worth, Texas in 1878 wasn't exactly a hotbed of scandal, but she could already imagine the whispers that would follow them. The widow Zimmerman and that Xavier fellow, can you believe it? At their age. But as she looked up into Frank's eyes, warm and brown and filled with such open adoration, she found she didn't care what anyone thought. All right, she said softly. Yes, court me, Frank Xavier. Come calling and bring me flowers and take me on buggy rides. Let's see where this leads. The smile that broke across Frank's face was like sunrise, and before Flora could think better of it, she found herself rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. It was just a brief touch, soft and tentative, but it sent heat cascading through her body. Frank made a sound low in his throat and cupped her face with his free hand, deepening the kiss just slightly before pulling back, both of them breathing hard. That's not how proper courting goes, he said, but he was grinning. Well, we're both a bit old to be proper, Flora replied, feeling bold and alive in a way she hadn't for years. Frank stayed until evening, and they sat on her porch drinking coffee and talking like they had 1,000 times before. Except now, everything was different. He told her about the years he'd spent fighting his feelings, about the guilt he'd carried, about the loneliness of his empty house. She told him about the grief that had consumed her after William's death, about slowly learning to find joy in small things again, about the confusing feelings she'd developed for her neighbor that had seemed inappropriate and impossible. My boys are going to be shocked, Frank said at one point, referring to his sons who were now 23 and 25, running their own spreads further west. They'll think I'm after your ranch, Flora joked, and Frank snorted. They'll think I'm the luckiest man in Texas, which would be accurate. He reached over and took her hand again, and Flora marveled at how natural it felt. I should go before it gets full dark, but I'll be back tomorrow morning. Earlier than tomorrow morning if you need me. You fire a shot if there's any trouble at all. I will, Flora promised. Frank stood reluctantly, settling his hat back on his head. He paused at the edge of the porch, looking back at her. Flora, I meant what I said. You've always been the one for me. Even when I couldn't admit it, even when it was impossible, it was always you. After he left, Flora sat on the porch until the stars came out, her fingers touching her lips where he'd kissed her, her heart full in a way she'd forgotten was possible. True to his word, Frank arrived the next morning with a bouquet of wildflowers he'd obviously picked from the meadow between their properties. Flora laughed and accepted them, putting them in a jar on her kitchen table where she could see them while she worked. He stayed for breakfast, and then insisted on riding her fence line again to check for signs of the rustlers. The days that followed fell into a new pattern. Frank would arrive every morning, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with fresh game he'd shot, sometimes just with his presence. He'd help her with the heavy ranch work, mend fences or move cattle or fix whatever needed fixing. She'd make him lunch, and they'd sit together talking, peeling back the layers of years they'd spent as merely neighbors to discover who they really were beneath. Frank told her about his childhood in Tennessee, about coming west as a young man looking for adventure and finding Margaret instead, about building his ranch from nothing, about the pride he felt watching his sons grow into good men, about the grief that had nearly destroyed him when Margaret died, and how he'd pushed through it only because his boys needed him. Flora told him about growing up in Missouri, about meeting William at a church social, and knowing immediately he was kind and steady and safe. About the miscarriages that had broken her heart, the children she'd never gotten to hold. About the loneliness of widowhood, about learning she was stronger than she'd ever imagined she could be. "I wish I could have been there for you more," Frank said one afternoon as they sat by the creek that ran through her property. "After William died, I wanted to do more than just bring casseroles. I wanted to hold you and tell you everything would be all right. But I was afraid if I got too close, I wouldn't be able to hide how I felt." "You were there enough," Flora assured him. "Just knowing you were next door, that I could count on you if I needed help, it meant everything." By the end of the first week, Frank was kissing her goodbye every evening before he left, sweet lingering kisses that left Flora dizzy and wanting more. By the end of the second week, they were holding hands whenever they sat together, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. By the end of the third week, Flora was having trouble remembering why they were taking things slow. "Come inside," she said one evening when Frank stood to leave. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and she didn't want him to go. She never wanted him to go anymore. Frank studied her face carefully. "Flora, if I come inside and stay, people are going to talk." "Let them talk," she said firmly. "Frank, I'm 52 years old. I don't want to waste whatever time we have left being proper and careful. We've already wasted 20 years. "I don't want to rush you," he said, but his voice was rough with wanting. "You're not rushing me. I'm inviting you." Flora took his hand and tugged him toward the door. "Stay with me tonight. Stay with me every night." Frank let himself be led inside, and when he kissed her this time it wasn't sweet or tentative. It was passionate and desperate, 20 years of longing finally unleashed. Flora responded with equal fervor, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body pressed against his. They made it to her bedroom somehow, shedding clothes between kisses, and when Frank laid her down on the bed she'd shared with William, Flora felt no guilt, only rightness, only joy. "I love you," Frank whispered against her skin. "God, Flora, I love you so much." "I love you too," she whispered back, and realized it was true. Maybe she'd loved him for longer than she wanted to admit, but she definitely loved him now, completely and entirely. They made love with the tenderness of people who'd waited a lifetime for this moment, and afterward lay tangled together in the darkness, neither wanting to break the spell. "Marry me," Frank said suddenly, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. "I know it's soon, but we're not young anymore, and I don't want to spend another day not calling you my wife." Flora felt tears slip down her temples. "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." Frank kissed her again, and they made love once more, sealing their promise to each other. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Fort Worth church, with Frank's sons standing up as witnesses and half the town in attendance. The gossip had been fierce, exactly as Frank had predicted, but most of it was good-natured. The widow Zimmerman and Frank Xavier finally figured out what everyone else had known for years, was the general consensus, and Flora had been shocked to learn that apparently their feelings hadn't been as hidden as they'd thought. "We all wondered when you two would wake up," Frank's oldest son Jacob told Flora at the wedding reception. "Ma used to say she thought you and Pa had a special understanding, even when she was alive. She wasn't jealous of it. She said some people just connect on a soul level, and she was glad Pa had someone like that in his life." Flora's eyes welled with tears. "I never wanted to disrespect her memory." "You haven't," Jacob assured her. "Ma's been gone a long time, and Pa deserves to be happy again. We both think you're exactly right for him." His brother Thomas echoed the sentiment, and Flora felt a weight she hadn't known she was carrying finally lift. Frank's sons approved. The town approved. Most importantly, she and Frank approved, and that was all that really mattered. Frank moved into Flora's ranch house that night, since it was smaller and easier to manage than his larger spread. They decided to combine their properties, running them as one operation, which made practical sense and also meant they'd never be separated by that fence line again. The first few months of marriage were a revelation. Flora had loved William, but it had been a quiet, comfortable love. What she felt for Frank was fire and passion and deep, abiding friendship all mixed together. They laughed constantly, talked for hours, made love with an enthusiasm that would have scandalized anyone who thought 52 was too old for such things. They worked side by side during the day and fell into bed exhausted but happy every night. The rustler problem that had brought them together was resolved when a posse from town finally tracked down the gang and arrested them. Frank had ridden with the posse, and Flora had spent those 3 days terrified something would happen to him, that she'd finally found happiness only to have it ripped away. When he rode back safely, she'd thrown herself into his arms right there in front of everyone, not caring who saw. "Don't ever scare me like that again," she'd said fiercely. "I promise I'll always come back to you," Frank had replied, holding her tight. "Always, Flora, you're stuck with me now." Their first winter as a married couple was harsh, with snow that piled high and temperatures that plunged below freezing for weeks. But Flora had never been happier, curled up with Frank by the fire, reading aloud to each other or just sitting in comfortable silence. They played cards and told stories and made plans for the spring. "I want to expand the cattle operation," Frank said one evening. "With both ranches combined, we've got the grazing land for it. Could make us quite prosperous. Or we could scale back," Flora suggested. "We're not getting any younger, Frank. Do we really want to be working ourselves to death in our 50s? Frank considered this, then nodded slowly. "You're right. We've got enough to live comfortably. Maybe it's time to enjoy life a bit more, travel even. Would you like that?" "To see something beyond Fort Worth." Flora's eyes lit up. "I've always wanted to see the ocean." "Then we'll go to the ocean," Frank promised. "This summer, when the ranch work is lighter, we'll take a trip to Galveston and walk on the beach. I'll find you seashells and we'll eat fresh oysters and dance under the stars." True to his word, when summer came, they hired a couple of ranch hands to watch the property and took the train south to Galveston. Flora had never seen the ocean before, and when she stood on the beach for the first time, feeling the salt spray on her face and watching the endless expanse of water, she cried. "It's so beautiful," she said, and Frank wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Not as beautiful as you," he murmured against her ear, and Flora turned in his arms to kiss him. They spent 2 weeks in Galveston, staying in a hotel room with a view of the water, exploring the city, eating at restaurants, behaving like the newlyweds they were. Frank bought Flora a strand of pearls that she protested was too expensive, but wore every day anyway. Flora bought Frank a new hat to replace the battered one he'd been wearing for years. They danced at a seaside pavilion and drank wine and made love with the windows open so they could hear the waves. "Thank you," Flora said on their last night, lying in Frank's arms. "For this trip, for this year, for finally telling me how you felt. You've given me a whole new life, Frank." "You've given me one too," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "I was just existing before, going through the motions. Now I'm living again, really living. That's all you, Flora." They returned to Fort Worth tanned and relaxed, ready to settle back into ranch life. The years that followed were good ones. They had their share of hardships, droughts and harsh winters, cattle diseases and broken equipment, all the usual struggles of ranch life. But they faced them together, and that made all the difference. Frank's sons visited regularly, often bringing their own wives and eventually children. Flora delighted in being a step-grandmother, spoiling the little ones and loving them as if they were her own grandchildren. The ranch house was filled with laughter and noise during those visits, and Flora treasured every moment. "I always wanted this," she told Frank one evening after Jacob and his family had left. "A house full of children and love. I'm so glad I get to have it, even if it came later than I expected." "Better late than never," Frank said, pulling her close. "And we've still got plenty of good years ahead of us." He was right. They did. Years of working together and laughing together and loving each other. Years of watching sunsets from their porch and dancing in the kitchen and falling asleep tangled together. Years of being not just husband and wife, but true partners in every sense of the word. When Frank turned 60, Flora threw him a party that brought together everyone from their combined ranches and half of Fort Worth. She made a speech that had everyone laughing and crying, talking about the cowboy who'd been her neighbor for 20 years before finally getting up the courage to tell her she'd always been the one for him. "He was worth the wait," she finished, raising her glass. "To Frank Xavier, the best man I know and the love of my life." Frank had tears in his eyes when he stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her soundly to the applause and catcalls of their guests. "And to Flora Xavier," he said when he finally released her, "who was always too good for me but agreed to marry me anyway. You're my heart, Flora, my whole heart." The party lasted well into the night, and when everyone finally left, Frank and Flora sat on their porch in the darkness, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest. "Happy birthday," she murmured. "Happiest one I've ever had," he replied. "Every day with you is a gift, Flora. I don't take a single one for granted." "Neither do I," she said, tilting her face up for a kiss. More years passed, good years and difficult ones, but always years they faced together. They weathered economic downturns and natural disasters, health scares and family dramas. Frank broke his leg in a fall from a horse when he was 63, and Flora nursed him through the recovery with patience and humor. Flora came down with pneumonia when she was 65, and Frank sat by her bedside for a week straight, refusing to leave until she was out of danger. "You promised you'd always come back to me," she whispered weakly when she finally woke from the worst of the fever. "And you have to keep the same promise," Frank said fiercely, gripping her hand. "Don't you dare leave me, Flora. We've got more years ahead of us. Lots more." She recovered, and they did have more years. Years of continuing to discover new things about each other, of deepening their love, of building a life that was richer and fuller than either had imagined possible. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Flora back to Galveston. They were older now, moved a bit slower, but the magic was still there. They walked on the beach hand in hand, collected seashells, ate at the same restaurants they'd visited before. They danced again at the seaside pavilion, though not as energetically as they once had, and made love with the windows open to hear the waves. 10 years, Flora marveled. "It's gone by so fast." "Best 10 years of my life," Frank said. "Though technically you've been the best part of my life for 30 years now. 20 as my neighbor, 10 as my wife. Here's to 30 more," Flora laughed. "We'll be 92, Frank. That's optimistic. So, we're stubborn. We'll live that long just to spite anyone who says we can't." He pulled her close and kissed her. "I love you, Flora Xavier. I'll love you until the day I die and probably beyond that." "I love you too," she whispered. "Always." They returned home to Fort Worth and continued their life together. Frank finally convinced Flora to hire more ranch hands so they could scale back their work even further. They started taking long rides just for pleasure, exploring parts of Texas they'd never seen before. They visited Frank's sons more often, spending weeks at a time at their ranches, doting on the grandchildren. When Flora turned 70, she was still as sharp and lively as ever, though her hair was completely white now and her body didn't move as easily as it once had. Frank, at 70 as well, was similarly aged but still vigorous, still the tall, handsome cowboy she'd fallen in love with, just with more wrinkles and a slower step. "We're getting old," Flora said one morning, catching sight of their reflection in the mirror as they prepared for the day. "Speak for yourself," Frank retorted, but he was smiling. "I feel young when I'm with you." "Liar," she said, but she kissed him anyway. They celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary quietly, just the two of them, with a special dinner Flora prepared and wine they'd been saving for a special occasion. They sat on their porch afterward, watching the sun set over the prairie they both loved so much, and reflected on the life they'd built together. "I was thinking about something," Frank said slowly, "about how different my life would have been if I'd never told you how I felt. If those rustlers hadn't come and scared me into action, I would have lived the rest of my life alone, and so would you, and neither of us would have had these past 15 years. 16 years if you count the courtship," Flora corrected with a smile. 16 years then. The best years, Flora. "I don't regret the life I had before. I loved Margaret, I love my sons, I'm proud of what I built. But this, with you, this is what I was always meant to have. You were always meant to be mine, and I was always meant to be yours. It just took us a while to figure it out." Flora felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I feel the same way. I spent so many years thinking my life was over, that I'd had my chance at love and lost it. I never imagined I could feel this way again, this happy, this complete. You gave me that, Frank. You gave me a whole second life." "We gave it to each other," Frank said, taking her hand and raising it to his lips. "Partners in everything, remember, partners in everything," Flora agreed. As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, comfortable in the silence that only comes from truly knowing another person. 35 years after they'd first become neighbors, 16 years after Frank had finally confessed his feelings, Flora and Xavier sat together in the home they'd built, surrounded by the life they'd created, and felt nothing but gratitude. The years continued to pass gently. Frank and Flora grew older, slower, but no less devoted to each other. They had the kind of love that deepened with time, that weathered all storms, that proved itself again and again in small daily acts of kindness and care. When Frank was 75, he developed a persistent cough that worried Flora. She insisted he see the doctor in Fort Worth, who prescribed rest and medicine. Flora fussed over him constantly, making sure he took his medicine, forcing him to stay in bed when he wanted to work, sitting with him and reading aloud from books and newspapers. "You're enjoying this too much," Frank grumbled one afternoon, though his eyes were warm with affection. "I'm taking care of my stubborn husband," Flora replied primly. "Someone has to make sure you don't work yourself to death." "I could never leave you," Frank said seriously, reaching for her hand. "Not after all this. I plan to live to 100 just so I can spend every possible day with you." He recovered from the illness, and they had several more good years. They celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary with their extended family gathered around them, Jacob and Thomas and their wives and children all there to honor the couple who'd proven that love could bloom at any age. "Tell us the story again," one of the grandchildren begged. About how Grandpa Frank finally told Grandma Flora he loved her. Frank and Flora exchanged a glance, and Frank launched into the tale he'd told many times over the years. About the rustlers and the gunshot, and running across the fence line to protect his neighbor. About finding the courage to finally confess feelings he'd hidden for 2 decades. About Flora's answering confession that she'd felt the same way. The moral of the story, Frank finished, pulling Flora close against his side, is that it's never too late to tell someone how you really feel. Your grandma and I wasted 20 years being just neighbors when we could have been so much more. Don't make the same mistake. If you love someone, tell them. Life's too short for regrets. Flora nodded in agreement, her eyes finding Frank's. After all these years, he could still make her heart race with just a look. And sometimes the person you're meant to be with is right there beside you, and you just haven't realized it yet. Keep your eyes open and your heart ready, because love can surprise you when you least expect it. The party was joyful and loud, full of laughter and love, and when it was over and Frank and Flora were alone again in their quiet house, they held each other close. 20 years, Flora marveled. 20 years of being your wife after 20 years of being your neighbor. 40 years you've been in my life, Frank Xavier. I can't imagine it without you. You'll never have to, Frank promised. We're going to grow old and cantankerous together and drive our grandchildren crazy with our stories and love each other until the very end. And then beyond, because I don't think death could stop what we have. That's very romantic for an old cowboy, Flora teased. I'm a romantic old cowboy because of you, Frank replied, kissing her softly. You bring out the best in me, Flora, always have. They continued their life together, each day a gift they didn't take for granted. There were hard times when Jacob was badly injured in a riding accident and they rushed to his ranch to help. When the worst drought in decades hit, and they struggled to keep their cattle alive. When Flora fell and broke her wrist and had to let Frank do everything for her for weeks. But there were more good times than bad. Quiet mornings drinking coffee on the porch together. Long conversations that ranged from the profound to the ridiculous. Laughter over shared memories and inside jokes. The comfort of sleeping side by side every night, of waking up to each other every morning. The simple joy of just being together, of having found in each other the person who made life worth living. When they reached their 25th wedding anniversary, Frank and Flora were both in their late 70s, moving slowly but still sharp mentally and still deeply in love. They celebrated with a small family gathering, and Frank gave a toast that left everyone in tears. 25 years ago, I married the woman I'd loved from afar for 2 decades, he said, his voice still strong despite his age. I thought I knew what love was, but Flora has taught me that love is bigger and deeper and more wonderful than I ever imagined. It's choosing each other every day. It's working together through the hard times. It's laughing together through the good times. It's building a life brick by brick, memory by memory, kiss by kiss. Flora Xavier, you are the greatest gift of my life, and I thank God every day that I finally found the courage to tell you that you'd always been the one for me. Flora was crying openly now, and she stood to kiss her husband while everyone applauded. And I thank God every day that I said yes, she said when she could speak again. You've made me happier than I ever thought possible, Frank. These past 25 years with you have been the best years of my life. That night, lying in bed together, they talked about the future in a way they hadn't before. They were getting older, and they both knew their time together, while precious, was limited. I want you to know something, Frank said seriously. If something happens to me first, I want you to keep living, Flora, really living. Don't shut yourself away in grief. Find joy where you can. You did it once before after William died. You can do it again. Don't talk like that, Flora protested, but Frank shook his head. We have to talk about it sometime. We're not going to live forever, much as I'd like to. And I need to know that you'll be all right. He cupped her face gently. Promise me, Flora. Promise me you won't give up if I go first. Only if you promise me the same thing, Flora said, her voice breaking. If I go first, you have to keep living too. For our family, for yourself. Promise me, Frank." "I promise," he said, and they held each other close, both thinking about the inevitable ending that awaited them but determined to make the most of whatever time they had left. As it turned out, they had several more years together. Years that grew increasingly precious as they both felt time slipping away. They made sure to tell each other, "I love you," every single day, multiple times a day. They never went to bed angry. They held hands whenever they sat together. They kissed often, sweet, gentle kisses that spoke of enduring love. Flora was 81 and Frank was 81 when Frank's health began to seriously decline. The cough that had troubled him years before returned, worse this time, and the doctor diagnosed him with a serious lung condition. There wasn't much that could be done except make him comfortable. "I'm not ready," Flora said fiercely, sitting beside Frank's bed and holding his hand. "I'm not ready to lose you, Xavier. We need more time." "We've had 48 years, Frank said gently. His breathing was labored, but his mind was still clear. 48 years of you being in my life in one way or another. 28 years of you being my wife. That's more than most people get, Flora. We've been blessed." "It's not enough," she insisted, tears streaming down her face. "It'll never be enough. I need you, Frank. I don't know how to exist without you anymore." "Yes, you do," he said, squeezing her hand with what strength he had left. "You're the strongest person I know. You'll grieve, and that's right and natural. But then you'll keep living, because you promised me you would. You'll spend time with Jacob and Thomas and all those grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You'll sit on our porch and watch the sunsets we both love. You'll remember me, but you won't let missing me stop you from finding joy. That's what I want for you." Frank lingered for several more weeks, and Flora never left his side. Their sons came to say goodbye, bringing their families. Frank held each grandchild and great-grandchild, offered wisdom and love, made sure they all knew how proud he was of them. But mostly, he held Flora's hand and looked into her eyes, memorizing every detail of the face he'd loved for nearly half a century. "I don't regret a single day," he told her near the end. "Not the 20 years of hiding my feelings, because those years taught me patience and made me appreciate what we eventually had. And certainly not the 28 years of marriage. You made my life complete, Flora. I was half a person before you, and you made me whole." "You made me whole too," Flora whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "I love you, Frank. I'll always love you. Wait for me wherever you're going. Promise me you'll wait for me." "I promise," Frank said. "I'll be waiting. And Flora, thank you. Thank you for taking a chance on a cowboy who waited too long to tell you how he felt. Thank you for loving me back. Thank you for these beautiful years. It was all worth it. Every moment with you was worth everything." Xavier died peacefully 2 days later, with Flora holding his hand and whispering that she loved him. He was 81 years old, and he died knowing he'd been completely loved, which was all anyone could ask for. Flora grieved deeply, but she kept her promise. She didn't shut herself away or give up on life. She leaned on Jacob and Thomas, who supported her with the same love and care their father had shown them. She spent time with the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, making sure they knew what an extraordinary man he'd been. She continued to live in the ranch house they'd shared, surrounded by memories of Frank. She sat on the porch every evening and watched the sunset, imagining Frank sitting beside her the way he had for so many years. She talked to him sometimes, updating him on family news, sharing her thoughts, telling him how much she missed him. But she also found moments of joy. She laughed with the great-grandchildren. She took pleasure in watching the prairie she and Frank had loved so much. She baked bread and tended a garden and read books. She lived, because that's what Frank had wanted for her. Flora lived to be 87 years old, and in those final 6 years without Frank, she often thought about their extraordinary love story, about how they'd been neighbors for 20 years, both hiding their feelings, both thinking it was impossible. About the day Frank finally found the courage to tell her she'd always been the one for him. About the 28 beautiful years of marriage that followed. About building a life together, facing every challenge side by side, loving each other more deeply with each passing year. She thought about how lucky they'd been to find each other, even if it took decades. How their love had proved that it's never too late, that you're never too old, that the right person can transform your entire world. How they'd taken what could have been a missed opportunity and turned it into a grand romance that lasted until death and beyond. When Flora's time finally came, she went peacefully in her sleep, in the bed she'd shared with Frank for so many years. Her last thought was of him, and of the promise he'd made to wait for her. As consciousness faded, she could have sworn she felt his hand taking hers, felt his presence beside her one more time. Jacob and Thomas buried their stepmother beside their father in the Fort Worth cemetery, under a headstone that read, Frank and Flora Xavier, neighbors for 20 years, partners for 28, together forever. The funeral was well attended, with people coming from all over to pay respects to a woman who'd been beloved in the community, who'd lived fully and loved deeply. At the reception afterward, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren shared their favorite stories about Frank and Flora, about their obvious devotion to each other, about how they'd held hands constantly and kissed in public even in their old age, not caring what anyone thought. About the way Frank had looked at Flora like she hung the moon, and the way Flora had smiled at Frank like he was the answer to every question. About a love story that had started late but burned bright until the very end. That's what I want, one of the great-granddaughters said, wiping away tears. A love like theirs, something real and true and lasting, something worth waiting for. That's what we all want, Jacob agreed, smiling despite his grief. And if we're very lucky, we'll find it, just like they did. It might take time, it might require courage, but if we're open to it, love can find us when we least expect it. That's what they taught us. That's their legacy. And it was true. Frank and Flora's love story became the stuff of family legend, passed down through generations. The cowboy who waited 20 years to tell his neighbor she'd always been the one for him. The woman who'd thought her chance at love had passed, only to discover it had been waiting next door all along. Two people who found each other late in life and built something beautiful and enduring that proved love has no expiration date, no age limit, no restrictions. Their ranch was divided among Jacob and Thomas's children, but the original house where Frank and Flora had lived was preserved as a family gathering place, maintained with love and care. Every summer, the extended family would gather there for a reunion, and they'd sit on the porch where Frank and Flora had spent so many evenings, and they'd tell the story again. The story of patience and courage, of friendship turning to love, of two lives joining to become one perfect whole. The story of Frank and Flora Xavier, neighbors for 20 years, lovers for 28, together for eternity. A reminder that it's never too late to take a chance on love, to tell someone how you really feel, to build a life with the person who was meant to be yours all along. A testament to the enduring power of love, to transform ordinary lives into something extraordinary, to turn neighbors into soulmates, to prove that happily ever after can begin at any age, as long as you're brave enough to reach for it. Their love story became a beacon of hope for everyone who heard it, proof that real love exists, that it's worth waiting for, that it can happen when you least expect it but need it most. And in the hearts of their descendants, in the memories shared around dinner tables and on front porches, in the way the family loved each other with devotion and dedication. Frank and Flora's love lived on, eternal and unbreakable, just as they'd always promised it would be.